Hey, it's Kay, and this is Skittles, Conductor. Today, we're going to talk about Bong Joon-ho's 2013 film, Snowpiercer. And if you've seen it before, it should come as no surprise to you that in order to talk about this film, we're going to need to talk about class. So before getting into it, I want to very briefly clarify my terms so we're all on the same page throughout the video. So, capitalist society, the thing that we all live in, is divided into two principal classes, the working class or proletariat and the capitalist class or owning class or bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie own the means of production, i.e. factories, businesses, machinery, and land, while the proletariat own only their labor, which they sell to the bourgeoisie to make their living. As you might imagine, this relationship is the source of some tension. It should be noted that being unemployed does not stop you from being working class if it is still true that you only own your own labor and not land or production that you can profit from. While the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are the two principal classes, there are those who in a way have one foot on either side of the divide. Small business owners who make much of their money from the labor of their employees but may directly work in their own businesses, sometimes called the petty bourgeoisie. And certain exceptionally high-paid workers, such as high-level managers, who do sell their labor for a living and do not own the means of production but who manage a lot of daily operations on behalf of the bourgeoisie, and are conferred a level of wealth and status that sets them and arguably their interests apart from other workers. These two groups come together to form what we would call the middle class. The middle class is a bit less clear-cut than the two principal classes because economically they are not a class unto themselves. However, they do make up a certain strata of society that needs to be considered, especially when discussing Snowpiercer. So why is that? The train in Snowpiercer is a visual representation of class society. It's basically this poster turned on its side. In the back are the poor, the working class, who live in abhorrent conditions and are tightly controlled by a police force as well as political rhetoric meant to reinforce their own powerlessness.
I belong to the front. You belong to the tail. Know your place. Keep your place.
At the front of the train is the leadership, the seat of power, furthest away from the masses in the back, the bourgeoisie. And in between them, the middle section of the train, where those fortunate enough to live in relative luxury enjoy a somewhat normal existence with access to good food, education, and healthcare. The film takes us through the events of a revolution as the people in the tail end of the train can no longer tolerate the conditions they're forced to live in. As they fight their way from the back all the way to the front of the train, they not only come up against the different barriers that are designed to keep them in their place, but they, and therefore we as the audience, are shown the lives of those in the middle and front of the train, sustained by the suffering of those in the back. There's a video about Snowpiercer by the Nerd Writer that observes that the people from the tail section, upon looking out the windows for the first time, see only death outside the train. The train here, to be perfectly clear, is the capitalist system. They've had so little opportunity to see outside the system that they can't imagine a future beyond it. Let's keep that idea in the back of our minds because it's significant that the middle section of the train has windows while the tail does not. The Nerd Writer's video points out that Namgung, the engineer from the middle section of the train, and his daughter are repeatedly found looking out the window, while the poor, oppressed masses from the tail end of the train focus on moving forward, towards claiming power. Namgung is looking beyond the system itself, beyond the train, which ultimately makes him the only one who understands the necessity of leaving the train. I want to respond to the nerd writer's reading of this film, not because I think his analysis is wrong, but because I think this idea requires a little more investigation. We need to talk about the middle class.
I heard old tales sectioners were lazy dogs that all doing their own shit.
The middle class has historically been the core support base for fascism. This was true in Mussolini's Italy, and it is true in modern America. Bong Joon-ho shows a sharp understanding of this fact in this scene. When the people from the tail end break out of their slums and begin really challenging power, after overwhelming the police, who was the next line of defense? A group of masked men, obviously meant to bring to mind a fascist militia, from the middle section of the train. When the regular and forces of capitalism can't do their job, fascism has historically moved in to maintain the domination of capital. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out my video on the topic. After making it past the fascist mob, our protagonists are led through the lives of the middle class. There's a crucial scene in the school section of the train that shows us how the education that the middle class receives not only enables them to perform labor that is more highly valued, to live better, wealthier lives, it also imbues them with ideological training.
If we ever go outside the train, we'd all freeze and die!
This does not end in childhood. Indeed, it continues all the way through university. And despite the narratives the far right tries to spin about schools being communist factories, typically the opposite is true. These institutions, in part, serve to reinforce the status quo. They are designed to be inaccessible to those outside of a certain class, and they teach students how to perform the characteristics of the classes that usually have access to them. That's the middle class and, of course, the children of the bourgeoisie. So, here's where we need to dig a little deeper, because the nerd writer's video notes a lot of this, while simultaneously explaining that Namgung is uniquely positioned to see outside the system because of the education and resources made available to him as part of the middle class. Something the working class in the back of the train have been deprived of. If the middle class is so effectively whipped up into violent fascist mobs to defend capitalism, if their education is designed to make them that way, why is Namgung different? Why does he align himself with the tailenders and not these guys? Namgung isn't just from the middle section of the train. He is an engineer who previously worked on the train itself, and as a result has intimate knowledge of how it works. In other words, Namgung is an intellectual. He's used the resources and access to education of his class position to learn how to critically analyze the system itself. He knows how capitalism ticks, and he knows how to move beyond it. Antonio Gramsci, an Italian socialist who was imprisoned by the fascists in 1926, would have described Namgung as a traditional intellectual. That's your scientists, scholars, theorists, what we would think of as a typical academic or intellectual today. But they have another crucial characteristic. The whole of idealist philosophy can easily be connected with this position assumed by the social complex of intellectuals, and can be defined as the expression of that social utopia by which the intellectuals think of themselves as independent, autonomous, endowed with a character of their own. The traditional intellectual considers itself and is considered by much of society to be separate from their class, as well as any interests and experiences that come with that class. They're seen as an independent, impartial entity existing only in the pursuit of knowledge. Now, Gramsci saw this as an illusion, and a dangerous one at that. Simply put, An education and a career of academic pursuits does not mean you exist outside of society. You still have a class background. You still perform labor in class society in the interests of one group or another. You still have political allegiances, biases, interests. And the danger comes from obfuscating those things, from allowing the intellectual to be considered a class in its own right, that exists above the petty political squabbling of the rest of us. Doing so leads to people like Jordan Peterson, who, because he could afford a good education and a suit, is not simply a clinical psychologist, the thing he actually studied. He is an intellectual. He is broadly considered perfectly qualified to speak on matters of biology, philosophy, economics, because he is seen as part of a group who is just there to think big thoughts, not to direct people or represent any particular class's interest. Gramsci, of course, understands the roles of intellectuals to be precisely that. In Snowpiercer, we see that Bong Joon-ho falls into this trap because of where we meet Nam-gung. We don't meet him in the back of the train with the impoverished masses. We don't meet him in the middle of the train with the middle class. We meet him in a prison car. What's noteworthy and what kinda confused me when I first saw this movie was how little interest the film seems to have in telling us about prison on the train. What's it like? What function does it serve? Who gets put in there? We are literally walked through every section of the train and shown everything. But prison, an important and dramatic aspect of capitalist society? Nothing. Because what's important about how we meet Nam-gung isn't that he was a prisoner so much as that he is separate from the rest of the train. He is independent, autonomous, endowed with a character of his own, and so has no loyalty or connection to any class, including the middle class that he came from. So Nam-gung, the intellectual, is the one who truly understands that the only way to be free of the train is to destroy it and go outside. While the revolution, led by the lowest rungs of society and Captain America, is actually set on a course to reproduce the exact system that the train represents. Wilfred, the creator of the train who lives at its front, names Curtis as his successor, and was even collaborating with a spy from the back to see this revolution through. The suggestion is that without the knowledge Nam-gung possesses, this revolution would have only installed a new bourgeoisie and maintained class society, but with him and the other rebels as its leaders. The system itself would remain intact. Bong Joon-ho would repeat this position that middle-class intellectuals are needed to actually overcome the current system in his 2019 film Parasite. Neither the poor family nor the very wealthy family can see the system they live in for what it is. They take it as a given. This leads to obliviousness and callousness from the rich family, while the working class characters lash out violently at each other. We only meet one character throughout the movie who seems to represent a more middle-class, well-educated person. Ki-woo's friend, who introduces him to the job and then quickly leaves the country and the story. Parasite sets up the same conflict that happens in Snowpiercer, but on a much smaller and less dramatic scale. And then it asks, what if we removed Nam-gung? In the end, Ki-woo can't even imagine a solution to the horrible situation his family is in, other than fantasizing about succeeding within the current capitalist system. Nobody can see outside the train. And there is some historical basis for this perspective. Revolutionary movements have often been led predominantly by intellectuals, by people from the middle class of society who had access to education and resources that the majority of workers simply did not. In Russia in 1917, only about a quarter of the population could read and write, so it's hardly any wonder that Lenin and many other key Bolsheviks were academics. For the task of educating and organizing a large number of people, as well as spreading ideas that are often only discussed in academic texts, you could argue that you need people with that background. But there is cause for concern here. If the middle class is the core base for fascism, if large swaths of it are prone to reactionary violence in times of crisis, doesn't the working class put itself in a vulnerable situation by having so much of our leadership and key organizers coming from that class? Because, and this is important, intellectuals are not separate from class society. The traditional intellectuals are overwhelmingly middle class and bourgeoisie. It is only a very recent development that so many of the working class have university degrees at all. But we are certainly underrepresented in the traditional intelligentsia. Bong Joon-ho comes from a family of middle-class intellectuals. His father is a university professor, his grandfather an esteemed author. He has a brother and sister, both teach at universities. It's not hard to see how his background has informed his ideas about political change. Despite clearly being interested in socialism, he remains certain that we need these traditional intellectuals to lead the working class towards a new way of doing things. I get why he thinks this, and I do love his movies, but I think he's wrong. It's not 1917 anymore. You can probably read and write. In fact, research published by Our World in Data says that while only 12% of the people in the world could read and write in 1820, today the share has reversed. Only 14% of the world's population in 2016 remained illiterate. And as you can imagine, the wealthier a country is, the closer to full literacy they tend to be. The barrier of literacy for most of us does not exist anymore. And the barrier of accessing information and education has shrunk severely since the inception of the internet. If you're watching this, you have internet access. You can find, largely for free, the majority of political theory and academic writing that exists. A lot of journals are paywalled, but plenty of clever people have found ways around that, and quite often, if you contact the author of an academic paper, they are all too happy to give you a copy. The primary barrier that remains for the working class is one of time and energy, as well as educational guidance. These are the things that the middle class, who make up so much of the traditional intelligentsia, still have a greater abundance of. But the working class has never before been this well armed to educate ourselves. Here we come to the other type of intellectual that Gramsci wrote about, the organic intellectual. Gramsci wrote that every class develops its own organic intellectuals with specialized skills to fulfill necessary roles in and direct the ideas of their class. In David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs, he discusses a type of non-productive work that has risen up to maintain and justify capitalist hegemony. Your middle managers, corporate administration, lobbyists, HR. We can think of these as the organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie. Though many of these people are not themselves part of the bourgeoisie as a class, what distinguishes these organic intellectuals is that their work is not productive in the material sense. They are cultural technicians who maintain and justify the position of the class that they perform intellectualism for, the bourgeoisie. But the working class develops organic intellectuals as well. Gramsci understood all people as participating in intellectualism to some degree, writing, "There is no human activity from which every form of intellectual participation can be excluded, and each man, finally, outside his professional activity, carries on some form of intellectual activity. That is, he is a philosopher, an artist, a man of taste. He participates in a particular conception of the world. He has a conscious line of moral conduct and therefore contributes to sustain a conception of the world or how to modify it. That is, to bring into being new modes of thought. Understanding intellectualism as something you do, not something you are, we're forced to confront the reality that all people are thinking beings capable of intellectualism. We're forced to question the validity of the prevalent idea that without a formal education, people cannot seriously engage with culture, politics, art, media, anything typically cordoned off as for intellectuals. The organic intellectuals of the working class are often specialized laborers who have skill sets their bosses do not, and therefore do work their bosses do not know how to do, i.e., most workers. And some are autodidacts who engage with things like history or critical theory on their own terms. If two workers on their lunch break who have never set foot in a university discuss current political events, are they not doing the activity of intellectuals? If a third coworker enters who is not familiar with what's being discussed, is he incapable of learning and engaging with it himself? Viewed this way, the idea put forward by Bong Joon-ho in Snowpiercer and to some extent Parasite, that the working class simply does not have the means to truly understand their own conditions, their own place in the social economic order, through no fault of their own, but through their lack of access to the realms of the intellectual, reveals itself to be patently false, pretty condescending, and showing a very narrow view of what an intellectual is. Crucial to Gramsci's understanding of the organic intellectual is that our experiences also inform our intellectual worldview. If you spend your time breaking your back at work all day and can barely pay your rent while your boss rolls up 3 hours late in a Lexus, barks some orders, and then heads home, you don't need to read Marx to see that something is wrong. You are accumulating knowledge and experience throughout your life as a worker, and that knowledge and experience is a major part of what sets you apart from the intellectuals of other classes. A rich man can read about the plight of the poor all he wants, he can never know it with the intimacy of someone who lives it. As Gramsci says, the intellectual's error consists in believing that one can know without understanding, and even more without feeling and being impassioned. But while lived experience is extremely important to helping us conceptualize the world and what needs to be changed to make it better, it is not enough on its own. Our history of political practice and theory is filled with well-developed conceptions of how our social and economic system works and how it can be changed, as well as attempts to do so. Theory put into practice, and lessons learned from that practice. If we want to transcend our current conditions, we need to combine that history with the real experiences and skills we've developed as workers. If we fail to do this, we will continue to be led by the intellectuals of other classes. Gramsci saw the problems inherent to allowing traditional academics to have so much control over working class movements, saying, although every social group develops its own organic intellectuals, the industrial proletariat has relied mostly on assimilated traditional intellectuals for leadership. And he believed the solution to this problem is education, which Gramsci viewed as a collective process in stark contrast to how higher education is often treated as a business transaction in our university institutions, which themselves have a class character that, much like the intellectuals they produce, they try to pretend does not exist. Gramsci wrote in the prison notebooks that the solution was to provide workers directly in the shops technical and industrial education as well as education in the humanities, so that from technical work the select worker arrives at technical science and historical humanistic views, without which he would remain a specialist and would not become a director. Education and labor hand in hand. Academic knowledge combined with our unique skills as workers. Crucially, we have the technical skills that society needs to function. It would mean some changes, but civilization could survive without bullshit jobs carried out by the organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie. But you need people to produce food, to collect garbage, to build houses. Ours is the necessary class who performs necessary labor, and we have a responsibility to educate each other, lest we be forever ruled by the class of bullshit jobs. Not only should we be thinking about how to develop educational institutions that are not part of the traditional academic system, we should be focusing on educating each other directly. Podcasts and videos explaining different concepts can be great. What's even better is to get some people you know together and form a study group. Learn collectively with your peers. This train is increasingly coming off the rails, and it has to go. But if we take that task into our own hands, rather than counting on the intellectuals of other classes to be class traitors and generously guide us, maybe we'll actually live to see the world outside the train.
What happens if the engine stops? We all freeze and die. But will it stop or will